I want to talk to you about Papias. He also has a vital connection with this very place, Smyrna. And so we're going to walk through the story of Papias and his contributions to early Christianity. Along with Polycarp, I would rate him as one of the two most important bridge figures between the apostolic era and the 2nd century, and the development of Christianity in the 2nd century. And eventually, he became the bishop of Hierapolis, where some of you are going, I gather, soon, and well, that you should. He became very famous in the church in various ways. This is a picture of Papias from the Nuremberg Chronicle in 1493. I'm sure you remember what happened in 1492. But this is, again, a picture of him as an episcopal person, as a bishop. So, some basic facts. Papias was born in about AD 60, and he died in AD 30. So what this means is, not only is he a contemporary of Polycarp, but Polycarp outlived him, and Polycarp was martyred. So far as we know, Papias was not martyred. His Greek name, Papias, is a common name in or near the province of Asia. And this suggests he was a native of this very area. For example, I found an inscription on a standing stone stele in the Hierapolis courtyard next to the Little Hierapolis Museum, which said the following: Papias Klesos Poimeneros, Christos Paraditas Chiron, which means Papias Klesos, anointed shepherd or anointed something, we're not sure about that word, to passersby, greetings. Nice little thing to put on your gravestone, greetings, right? So this is a common name, and this stone was found in Laodicea, but ended up at the Hierapolis Museum. A common name. Now, Papias is one of 5 apostolic fathers, also known as the Ante-Nicene Fathers, who were Christian theologians of the late 1st and into the early 2nd century. Some apostolic fathers may have known some of the apostles, and the question is whether Papias did or not. But clearly, all of these Ante-Nicene Fathers were influenced by the teaching of the apostles. Here's what Irenaeus says about Papias. He was, by the way, a sometime disciple of Polycarp. He says of Papias, quote, "He was an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp." Well, there you have the companion of Polycarp. Where would that have been? That would have been right here, by which I don't mean this basement underneath this hotel, but in this very town of Smyrna, for sure. Polycarp lived in Smyrna, and apart from one journey to Rome, he never left Smyrna. So Papias surely spent time right here. So what this means is 2 of the most important bridge figures that helped us consolidate the books of the New Testament, as well as creating their own theological contribution to the growth of Christianity, were right here. Scholars believe that Papias was a Christian during his entire adult life. I'll say more about this phrase, "he was a hearer of John," later, because there are a whole bunch of Johns. And while I've got it on my mind, could we stop calling John the Baptist John the Baptist? He wasn't a member of a Protestant denomination. He was John the Baptizer. Here we have 2 nice icons. On the left, you have an icon of Papias, and on the right, you have an icon of Polycarp. Now, iconography is symbolic in its way of interpreting people. You notice they both have halos, but notice as well that Polycarp is holding a book, and he's got this prominent protruding forehead. In Greek iconography, that indicates wisdom, not mere intelligence, but wisdom. So Papias became the bishop of Hierapolis, a city in the Lycus Valley. And this is probably later in his life, if you will. Hierapolis was a city founded about 190 BC by the king of Pergamum. In other words, it was a sort of colony city of Pergamum. Eusebius adds that Papias was bishop around the time of Ignatius of Antioch. Birth unknown, but we know that Ignatius died somewhere between 108 and 135 AD. So in this office of bishop, Papias was presumably succeeded by Abercius of Hierapolis, and we know he died in about 167. Now, one of the things I want to say to you, since most of you are Protestants, is there never was a time in the first century or the second or all the way up through the Middle Ages where there was not an external means of accountability for the local church. There were no such things as independent churches, period. There was always a Paul or a co-worker of Paul, or later there were bishops who were not members of local churches. They were external accountability factors for these local churches, and that is true of Papias. He didn't just park himself in Hierapolis in a local church. He had to do with Laodicea as well as Hierapolis, and he was checking on the various churches that were being found. The ruins of Hierapolis are near the modern city today of Pamukkale, and I presume you will be going there, some of you, tomorrow. Now, one of the things that is also in Hierapolis, which I want to mention just in passing, is the martyrion of Philip. The question is, which Philip? According to the Catholic tradition, this is Philip the Apostle. The problem with that is that all the evidence suggests it's Philip the Evangelist, mentioned in Acts 6, because it's he who has the prophesying daughters, and not Philip the Apostle. This is one of the major problems in the second century church. There were too many Johns and too many Marys and too many Philips, and they didn't have last names. Have you noticed that nobody in the New Testament has a last name as a Jewish name? I mean, think about it. I mean, Christ was not Jesus' last name. I'm sorry. It just wasn't. Magdalene was not Mary's last name. She's Mary of Migdal or Magdala, okay? People were identified by where they came from or who their father was. Simon Bar Jonah, Simon son of John or Jonah, okay? Or the city, like Jesus of Nazareth, okay? Or their religious affiliation, Simon the Pharisee. They didn't have last names. Very important. Hard to find in the cell phone log. How many Simons were there? A lot. How many Johns were there? A lot. How many Philips were there? A lot. Fortunately, the name Papias was local to Smyrna and the Lycus Valley, so we can narrow that one down. Now, Hierapolis was already famous for being a religious Greek city, long before Papias ever got there. It was a city of pagan priests, and also the plutonium, by which I don't mean the kind that makes nuclear weapons, okay? Papias and some of Philip's family succeeded in establishing a Christian presence in Hierapolis and passing on the Jesus tradition. Here, Papias shared one or more of the canonical gospels to new converts, and we'll say more about that in a minute. Probably Mark and John, perhaps also Matthew. Now here's what you need to understand about the spread of early Christianity. Apart from the emperor cult, Christianity was the only genuinely evangelistic religion of that era. Greek religions, traditional Greek religions, not evangelistic. Roman religions, not evangelistic. Jewish religions, basically not evangelistic. Not very much anyway, okay? Christianity was born as an evangelistic outreach movement. Look at Matthew 28 and look at the Pentecost story. That's very clear. And that distinguished this religion from the other traditional Greco-Roman religions, except for the emperor cult. The one new religion in the 1st century AD, other than Christianity, was the emperor cult, and that was the chief competitor. And you can see some of that through the critique of the emperor cult in Paul's letters and also in the book of Revelation. Here is a statue of our man Papias with the shepherd's crook, indicating that he's an episcopal figure. Now, this is an aerial picture of Hierapolis and that spectacular theater, which I hope you will be able to see when you go. But what I wanted you to notice is, you see the road that's beside the theater there? That's the pilgrim path that leads up to the Church of Philip, and a very important part of that whole city. Here again, some just shots of what we have in Hierapolis. There's plenty to see. There is a necropolis that is humongous on one end of the city of Hierapolis, and there are Jewish identified graves, and then there's this one tomb right next to the Frontinus gate of Flavius Zeuxis, who brags on his tombstone of this huge tomb, mausoleum really. It says, I, Flavius Zeuxis, made 26 round trips to Rome to do business, etc., etc., etc. And you know, it's amazing what people will put on their tombstones. We were in Silverton, Colorado some time ago, and there's a cowboy graveyard in Silverton, Colorado, and there was this gravestone that said, here lies the body of Roger Moore, shot in the back with a .44. No Roger, no more. It's amazing to read what's on tombstones. This is the main street that looks back towards the Frontinus gate. But let's talk about the plutonium for a minute. It's Pluto's gate. Pluto was the god of the underworld. There are other names for Pluto as well. No, he was not a cartoon character from the 60s, okay? He was the god of the underworld. And this gate was thought to take you down into Hades, which, by the way, is not hell. Hades is the land of the dead, okay? You get there by Charon putting you in a boat, you put coins on a person's eye, you take them down the river Styx into the land of the dead, okay? This particular entranceway into Hades involved a place where there were noxious gases, which could kill people. But one of the ways the priests maintained control over the people of this city in terms of pagan religion is they would send a dove down into this tomb where there was the noxious gases, and they wouldn't come out again. A chicken, nothing came out again. A dog, nothing came out again. And then the priests would go down in there, and they'd stay there for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, as long as they could hold their breath. And then they'd come back out again, and everybody'd go, wow, he's bulletproof from plutonium. And so that furthered the religion, because then what they would do is say they were inspired while they were down there and they were prophesying. Now this is important because who else came to town as prophets? Well, that was the daughters of Philip, the 4 prophesying daughters of Philip. So Hierapolis was already a center for some kind of prophecy before Philip and his prophesying daughters ever got there. Strabo, an ancient writer, in his Geographica, writes about this plutonium, and they've just reconstructed this. You can now see this when you go to Hierapolis. I would not advise you to go down in the cave. Now, more importantly than all of that, Papias wrote a book entitled Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord, Exegesis of the Sayings of the Lord, in 5 books. Oh, how I wish we had these. It would be spectacular. Eusebius had them, and the only way we know about them is the father of church history, Eusebius, in the 4th century, quotes Papias time and again. So does Irenaeus a little bit, so do some of the other church fathers as well. He is maybe the most important figure to tell us about the development of the Gospels and oral tradition in a Christian and Orthodox way. Here's another picture. This is Irenaeus of Lyon. Notice the prominent forehead again. Here's Eusebius, more hair, less forehead. Very interesting. But he's the one, since you've been to Nicaea, some of you are going to Nicaea, he's the one that Constantine commissioned to produce 25 copies of the Christian books we come to know as the New Testament on vellum or parchment, not papyri, for the circulation amongst 25 important churches. What do we know about these documents? Well, probably one of them is Codex Vaticanus, which is sitting in the Vatican today. We still have one of these, and it would be both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, here's what Irenaeus says. Papias was an ancient man who was a hearer of John and a companion of Polycarp. Now, he's writing this about 180, so Papias has come and gone. He's been dead for almost half a century. But which John are we talking about? Listen to what Papias says. And if by, this is a quote from Eusebius, if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders arrived, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said, or what Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any of the Lord's disciples had said. Notice the past tense. And whatever Aristion and John the elder, the Lord's disciples, were saying. Notice the contrast between had said, and Papias is not claiming to have met them personally, but he's counting on learning about what they said from oral tradition. But then there are two people that he claims to have heard personally, John the elder and Aristion, okay? For I did not think that information from the books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. I could talk to you at length about the importance of oral tradition in the early church. The living voice was more important than the written texts in many cases, and especially for early Christianity. This is actually how the word of the Lord was spread, by preaching and teaching and oral hearing. And unlike our students who are now incapacitated from memorizing things by their computer, ancient people were capable of listening and learning and memorizing large chunks of the teaching that they were hearing, because it was an oral culture to begin with. And Papias says that's much preferable to just looking at words in a text. The texts themselves were written in scriptum continuum. That is a continuous flow of Greek letters, no punctuation, no separation of sentences, no paragraphs, and yea, verily, no chapters and no verses. Chapters and verses don't show up until Archbishop Langton of Canterbury, who had far too much time on his hands, created those, and those things are not inspired, folks. The earliest manuscripts of the Bible didn't have chapters and verses. They had a continuous flow of Greek letters, and that required a professional reader. Not just anybody. The literacy rate anyway was not more than about 15 to 20% in the time of the New Testament and in the 2nd century AD. So if you want to hear the Gospel of Mark, you would have to have a lector who professionally read it out to people, or some learned person. Notice what Revelation 1 through 3 says. It says, listen to the proclamation of this revelation given to John. Listen to what they say out loud And then there's the person who's doing that is distinguished from the hearers of the man who's speaking. Two groups of people, a speaker and a whole bunch of hearers in the 7 churches. The documents were not just handed to a church and said, here, have a go. No, you had a professional reader who would read it to them. Papias was indeed a person who preferred the oral testimony. Again, the title of his work was The Sayings, the Exegesis of the Sayings of the Lord. And we do have portions in Eusebius, Irenaeus, and fragments in other church fathers. The quote that I just read to you is from the preface to Papias' work, as quoted by Eusebius. Now, here's something you need to know about Eusebius. He really didn't like the book of Revelation. If he had had a decisive veto, he would have left it out of the canon altogether, okay? But most of the earliest church fathers were what later came to be called Chiliasts. What's that? People who believed in Revelation 20, in the 1,000-year reign. Now, they were not dispensationalists. They didn't believe in a pre-tribulation or mid-tribulation rapture, but they did believe that when Christ came back, there would be a 1,000-year reign upon the earth before the new heaven and new earth and before the last judgment, okay? And that is not only true of Papias, it's also true of Polycarp and Tertullian and those others that we can actually name, including the church fathers from Antioch as well. So, the quote is from the preface. And here's what Eusebius says about Papias. And the reason he's saying this is he doesn't like the fact that Papias affirms the book of Revelation as telling us about the future. He by no means declares that he was himself a hearer or eyewitness of the holy apostles. And then he goes on to say, and he was a man of limited wit. Okay, but notice what he does say about him. He says he was not a hearer of the original apostles. He did not hear John, son of Zebedee, nor did he hear Philip, one of the 12. But he certainly knew Philip the evangelist, who was also in Hierapolis. So there is a scholarly debate about which John Papias heard late in the 1st century AD, whom he calls John the Elder. Footnote, there are 2 letters in the Johannine corpus that are said to be by whom? The Elder. That would be 2nd John and 3rd John. You with me so far? Yeah. The author of those documents doesn't claim to be an apostle. He claims to be what? A church elder. That's what he claims to be. Keep that in mind. Note the distinction in the quote between what they were saying and what had been said by the original disciples, Peter, James, John, etc. John the Elder is not grouped with the original group. He's grouped with Aristion, presumably a Christian in the late 1st century AD, like John the Elder. Now, here's where I tell you something you may not know. There is papyrological evidence, clear evidence, that John Zebedee, like his brother James, was martyred in the middle of the 1st century AD. After all, what did Jesus say to James and John? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism I'm about to be baptized with? And then they said, yes, we are able, strong, brave, and true. They were so not ready for martyrdom at that point. Indeed, they asked Jesus for the box seats in the kingdom. Remember that part? Well, in fact, we do have papyrological evidence from Papias that John, son of Zebedee, died in the middle of the 1st century AD and is not the author of the 4th gospel. It is odd that the survey and presentation of all the Papias fragments in the most recent book on Papias by Shanks in 2013 doesn't even mention this papyrus or the article about it by Oberweis. That's passing strange. Richard Bauckham, in his important study, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and I recommend this book to all of you, especially the second edition from 2017, stresses that Papias refers to two Johns, only one of which was still alive while Papias was alive. And as Bauckham says, Papias is referring to a meeting of Aristion and John the Elder that he had earlier in his life, not at the time he wrote his treatise on Jesus' sayings, but before then. So Bauckham concludes that John the Elder is the author of the fourth gospel, not John Zebedee, and that Papias wrote his work at the turn of the era, somewhere around 100 AD or a little later. Now, the source of the eyewitness material in John's gospel is said to be the beloved disciple. But who's he? The first reference to a beloved disciple is in John 11. Lord, the one whom you love is ill, says Martha, sending a message to Jesus. You remember this? The very next verse says it was Lazarus. I mean, his real name is Eliezer, but we call him Lazarus. That's an anglicized form of the name. All right? And there are no references to the beloved disciple in the first 10 chapters of John. The first reference to somebody whom Jesus in particular loved was Lazarus in John 11. And then we have the phrase in John 13 and following, the beloved disciple. Now, if you're just reading the gospel the first time and you're working your way straight through, the normal deduction you would come to is that the beloved disciple is a Judean disciple named Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. And that would explain a lot of extra things about what happens in the rest of the gospel. For example, who was there at the cross? According to the Gospel of John in chapter 19, there's Mary, and did I mention Mary? And the beloved disciple. You with me so far? And the synoptics say the apostles were not there. The synoptics say they denied, they betrayed, and they ran away. They were not there at the cross when Jesus died, but the beloved disciple was. Who was he? He was a Judean disciple named Lazarus. And so when Jesus says, "Son, behold your mother," we already know he has this close personal relationship with Lazarus. He's bequeathing his mother to the disciple whom he loves. And guess where he lived? In Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. So when Mary is bequeathed to the beloved disciple, where do they go? Not to Galilee. They go to Bethany, just down the road from Jerusalem. And we hear about Mary one more time in Acts 1:14. She's there in the upper room praying for Pentecost. She didn't go back to Galilee. She stayed in Jerusalem. Notice also at the end of the Gospel of John, we have this interesting remark. We know, says the writer of the Gospel, that his testimony is true. Who's the his testimony? That's the beloved disciple. Who's the we know? That would be John the Elder, who composed and gathered together the testimony of the beloved disciple, put it all together in one form. Now here's just a couple of other facts that deal with this. If you read the Gospel of John, guess what's missing? All the special Zebedee stories. When the Zebedees were present to watch the raising of Jairus' daughter, that story is not in John. When the Zebedees were present on the Mount of Transfiguration, that story is not in John. When the Zebedees asked for the box seats in the kingdom, that story is not in John. I could keep going. If this was an eyewitness testimony of John, son of Zebedee, it is passing strange because they left out all the important stories that they were in particular part of in the ministry of Jesus. And anyway, in the Gospel of John, what we have instead of Galilean miracles, and there is only one Galilean miracle in all four Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking of water with Jesus. That's it, okay? Instead, what do we have? A conversation with Nick at night, not in the Synoptics. A conversation with a Samaritan woman on the way to Jerusalem, not in the Synoptics. The raising of Lazarus from the dead, not in the synoptics. The healing of the blind man, John 9, not in the synoptics. The healing of the paralytic, also not in the synoptics. And all of those Lazarus, blind man, paralytic stories are centered where? In and around Jerusalem. This is the testimony of a Judean disciple who is an eyewitness. And praise be to God, we have 3 gospels based on the Galilean ministry and 1 gospel based on the Judean ministry of Jesus. Only in the Gospel of John are we told that Jesus made multiple trips up to Jerusalem during the festival times, because he did. He did. Now, I agree with Eusebius that the John in question was also the author of Revelation. In other words, John the Elder not only wrote 2 John and 3 John and edited the beloved disciples' testimony in the Gospel of John, he also wrote, wait for it, the book of Revelation. Now, what does the book of Revelation tell us about this person? It doesn't ever call him an apostle. It says he was a seer. That is, a visionary who had visions and told those visions. And where was he when this happened? He was in exile. Who sent him there? The emperor. Why? Because of his Christian testimony in Asia, starting in Ephesus. After Domitian died, this particular John came back to Ephesus and helped continue the Christian community in that place, gathered the testimony of the beloved disciple, and produced what we call the Johannine literature. I agree with Bauckham that the evidence suggests that Papias knew John's gospel, as well as especially Mark and probably Matthew as well. Now, if you are a careful reader of not just the New Testament, but the early Christian documents from the late 1st and early 2nd century, which include the Didache, Shepherd of Hermas, Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, this is what what Justin Martyr says. Right-minded Christians believe there will be a resurrection of the dead and a 1,000-year reign in Jerusalem, which then will be built and adorned and enlarged, as the prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah and others declare. The earliest form of eschatology after Jesus was an eschatology that included a 1,000-year reign of Christ upon the earth before the new heaven and the new earth. Irenaeus, towards the end of the 2nd century, also takes a chiliastic interpretation of Revelation, saying John's quite serious about this 1,000-year reign. And I actually think that if you read 1 Corinthians 15 closely, he also is suggesting this same thing. He says what? When Christ returns, who's raised? The dead in Christ, not everybody. Not a general resurrection. When Christ returns, the dead in Christ are raised. And then it says, and Christ must reign upon the earth until he puts what? All of his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be put under his feet is what? Death. Now, I pondered that for a long time, and then it dawned on me. What, according to John, happens at the end of the reign of Christ on the earth during the so-called millennium, right? He raises the rest of the dead not in Christ. Well, if there's nobody in the land of the dead, then death has been overcome. So I think that 1 Corinthians 15 is also compatible with what we read in Revelation 20 in regard to these things. Here's a quote. John therefore did distinctly foresee the first resurrection of the just and the inheritance in the kingdom on earth, and what the prophets had prophesied concerning it, harmonizing with his vision. For the Lord also taught these things when he promised that he would have a mixed cup new with his disciples in the kingdom, on the earth, at the Messianic banquet. The apostles too have confessed that the creation shall be free from the bondage of corruption, so as to pass into the liberty of the sons of God by stages. Stage 1, the 1,000 years reign, stage 2, the new heaven and the new earth. Arthur Wainwright, in his study of early church history, says, without a doubt, premillennialism, not dispensational premillennialism, but historic premill, was the dominant form of eschatology in the late 1st, 2nd, and into the 3rd centuries. The person who turned the tide became the father of church history. That would be Eusebius. And he was followed by the most famous early Middle Ages theologian. His name was Augustine. And what they came up with is what later was called amillennialism, or even inmillennialism, suggesting that the church age is the millennium. Now, the problem with that is severe. Would you say that Satan's been in a holding tank throughout all of church history?
Oh, yeah.
No. No, he's been wild and active in all centuries of Christian history. So that interpretation of the millennium just doesn't work on the basis of Revelation 21 and 2, to say the least. It was the conversion of Constantine and those like Eusebius who worked with him that changed the eschatological tide in the church, and it was especially canonized for the medieval church by Augustine. And what this also did is shifting the focus from the historical horizon to heaven. In other words, in the Middle Ages, we have basically an otherworldly afterlife theology. Did you notice that only 2% of the New Testament, of the earliest documents like Paul's letters, even mention dying and going to heaven? Paul's all about the return of Christ and the resurrection of the dead on earth. Absolutely. The earliest liturgy of the church for funerals says this: in sure and certain hope, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of what? Dying and going to heaven? No, the resurrection. The resurrection. And by the way, dying and going to heaven is not the resurrection, for sure. In the book of Revelation, pay attention to the saints under the altar. They're grumpy. They're up there singing the blues. My daddy done told me we're having a bad day. How long, O Lord, how long? The angels give them a robe and tell them to hush, that God will do justice in his own good time. Going to heaven is a nice, ultra-clean bus station on the way to the resurrection, but it is not our final destiny. But in the Middle Ages, focus on afterlife in the heavens became the dominant form of afterlife theology, not on the basis of the New Testament, but on the basis of the theology inherited from Eusebius and Augustine and other church fathers in the Middle Age. There, as far as I can tell, there was no amillennialism before Constantine, as far as I can tell. Now, Papias attributes his knowledge about Mark's gospel to John the Elder, whom he heard speak about the Gospels. I want to just press on and read for you the quote in Eusebius about Mark's gospel. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, the hermeneut of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by the Lord. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him. This is Mark he's talking about. But afterwards, as I said, he heard and accompanied Peter, who used to give his teaching in Aramaic, not in King James English, in Aramaic, in the form of krya, that is, short, pithy, historical summaries with a punchline at the end, like, for instance, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. However, with God, all things are possible. Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them, for he was careful of one thing, not to admit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. This is in Eusebius's church history. Now, the interesting thing is this. Even though the early church was very concerned to tag the gospel testimony to the apostles, the original 12, even though that was true, they admitted that the earliest gospels we had, like Mark and Luke, were not written by one of the 12. Were not written by eyewitnesses of the original events. Mark was the interpreter of Peter. His testimony was from Peter. And Luke is very clear in Luke 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to write an account of the things that have happened amongst us, O noble Theophilus, I too, having observed these things for a long time, and having consulted who? The eyewitnesses and the original preachers of the word, I'm going to give you the straight story in order as to what happened amongst us. Now, Luke is not claiming to be an eyewitness, but he's claiming to what? To have met with and taken down the testimony of eyewitnesses and the original preachers of the word. The early church would not have made up the idea that a non-apostle named Mark and a non-apostle named Luke would write two of the earliest gospels. This is clearly a testimony of how important it was to get the story straight and tell the truth about where these gospels came from. Now, of course, Peter was definitely an eyewitness, no question about it. And Luke, presumably, during his travels with Paul, ran into quite a lot of eyewitnesses. In fact, my theory would be, you remember that Paul was taken prisoner in the temple in Jerusalem, and who was with him? Luke. Paul was incarcerated in Caesarea Maritima under house arrest for 2 years. I don't think Luke just twiddled his thumbs for 2 years. I think Luke went and consulted the Christians in Jerusalem during that time. He went after and talked to Mary, amongst other things, during that time, hence the birth narratives in the Gospel of Luke. He went to find the eyewitnesses and the original preachers of the word during those 2 years. And then when he continued to travel with Paul on the second and third missionary journeys and all the way to Rome, he continued to gather the evidence that we have in Luke and in the book of Acts. It's important that we understand how we got these Gospels. By the providence of God and by the guidance of a good God, we have not one, not two, not three, but 4 portraits of Jesus. Praise the Lord, because Jesus was far too complex a figure to only be reported in one source. Far too complex a figure to only be quoted in one source. We should be thankful we have 4 portraits of Jesus in the Gospels, to say the least. Now, Papias emphasized that Mark arranged his material, but not in a chronological order. It seems pretty clear that Papias takes the Gospel of John to be the one that gives us the clearest chronological order, and that Mark was arranging material more, say, topically, if you will. I was on a Johannine literature panel in the SBL some years back, and we were talking about Jesus' cleansing of the temple. Jesus cleanses the temple very early on in the Gospel of John, as you may remember. But in all 3 synoptics, it happens when? During the last week of Jesus' life. You with me so far? All 4 Gospels agree Jesus cleansed the temple once. Not twice, once. But the placement is different in John than it is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why? Because the arrangement in John is theological, not chronological. At the beginning of the Gospel of John, we learn that he is the Lamb of God, that he is the Word of God, that he is the temple, and he is even our priest as well. What is being told us at the beginning of the Gospel of John is that Jesus replaces the institutions of Judaism with himself. It's one-stop shopping in Jesus. Okay? We are being told in the Gospel of John that God's revelation is summed up and fulfilled in Jesus. That's what's going on there. Now, the problem with words like taxis and soon taxis in Luke's preface in Luke 1 through 4 is there are various ways to do orders, chronological orders, theological orders, and actually I think it's a good thing we have both, to say the least. But most importantly, PAPIAS gives us the evidence that Mark's witness to Jesus is the earliest witness, because it goes directly back to the chief of the apostles, Peter himself. And that's very important. What is interesting is, however, that the church in the 2nd century preferred Matthew's gospel. If you're wondering why Matthew is the first gospel in the collection of the New Testament, it's because it was number 1 on the Billboard hit parade. It was the most copied, most used, most widely circulated of the 4 gospels, by a lot. And Mark was the least used, least circulated, and not really thought to be nearly as important as Matthew. And the chief reason is because in Matthew, we have far more teaching material than we do in Mark. We actually have 5 blocks of teaching material in Matthew, or maybe even 6, okay? We don't have that in the Gospel of Mark. We have a little block of parables in Mark 4 and apocalyptic teaching in Mark 13, but otherwise it's mainly a story. In Matthew, we alternate blocks of teaching with action. Blocks of teaching, action. Blocks of teaching, action. And be sure that it's not the case that Jesus said to the disciples, okay, today I'm just going to be a talking head. Tomorrow I'll just do a few miracles. Then I'll be a talking head again. No, it didn't happen that way. This is Matthew's arrangement of material so that we would have a collection of the teachings that went together, like the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, which is Jesus's greatest hits. And how do we know this? Because it's spread all over Luke's gospel. It's not in one place. In Matthew, it's gathered into one svelte, combined teaching, Matthew 5 through 7. And we should be thankful that Matthew arranged things for us to make it easier on us. So, why is PAPIAS so important? Because he sets us on the right path to doing the proper historical study of who wrote the Gospels and why they wrote the Gospels and how their eyewitness testimonies were important to tell us the truth about Jesus so that we would see him more clearly, love him more dearly, and follow him more nearly. And all God's people said, Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. Now, I don't mind staying a few extra minutes if you have some questions. If you'd like to, you may fire them up. It's up to Levent. Yes.
Is how you outline the development of the Gospels, does it say anything about the so-called Q source? Is this an alternative, or how do you?
No, I would say the Q source is the non-Markan sayings material found in Matthew and in Luke. Okay. So I think there was collections of, I think the Gospel of Thomas, though it is not an orthodox source, right, lets us know there were collections of Jesus' sayings that circulated early on, maybe before the writing of any of the Gospels. Although I think probably Mark's Gospel was written so early that he didn't have access to all of the sayings material that we do find in Matthew and Luke. So I would date Mark's Gospel late 60s, and then Matthew and Luke from the 70s and 80s, and then John, the last of all, in the 90s. And 3 of them are clearly like ancient biographies. But Luke Acts is a historical monograph written like a Greek historical monograph. And that preface to Luke's gospel makes that clear. So if you're really concerned about synchronisms with Roman history, only Luke's interested in that subject and Luke 2, at the beginning of Luke 2, beginning of Luke 3. We are very fortunate to have a diverse collection of gospels like we do have. Other questions or thoughts? Well, thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emmanuel, Lagos, Nigeria again. So I'm a Bible teacher in a local church, and I really enjoy listening to you, and it resonates with how I think, what I'm thinking, and how I see things. Now, my question is, how do I begin to explain this to people I teach?
Sure.
Without rocking their boat or
without blowing their minds. You know what I say? You commit yourself to a long obedience in the same direction of carefully teaching them the Word of God. And then you ask the right questions at the right time. For example, have you noticed that there's no reference to the beloved disciple in the Synoptic Gospels, nor in the first 10 chapters of the Gospel of John? But then we have that reference in John 11, that this is the one whom Jesus loved, Lazarus. And then after that, in John 13, and again, in John 19, and John 20, John 21, we have reference to the beloved disciple. How would you read that if you were reading the Gospel of John for the first time? So you raise questions and you let them think about it, and then they let them reread the text. To me, one of the most compelling things was, think about the story of the resurrection. So the women run into Jesus, and then they go and tell the men. And then Peter and the beloved disciple run to the tomb, which, by the way, beloved disciple knows where it is because he's from there. He gets there first. And Peter is there. He walks right into the tomb, and he sees the grave clothes, and he goes, well, he's not here. And then it says, catch this, and the beloved disciple believed that he was raised from the dead, though he did not yet know this from Scripture. Why did he believe it? Well, what happened to Jesus had just happened to him slightly earlier. He also had been raised from the dead. He also unwrapped the grave clothes. He also came out of a tomb, right? That kind of experience kind of leaves an impression on you, you know. But fast forward to 21 for a minute. At the end of 21, we have this precious Peter and the beloved disciple and Jesus are walking off. And Peter says, well, what about this man? Pointing to the beloved disciple. And Jesus says, if it is my will that he remain until I return again, what's that to you? You have to follow me. And then we have this parenthetical remark by the gospel writer. Jesus did not say it was his will for the beloved disciple to live until the second coming. He simply said, if it is my will, conditional statement. Now, why do we need that qualification? Because the beloved disciple has died again. He's dead again. That's why they're collecting his testimony and editing it, and John is putting it together. That's why that's happening. And so you need an explanation. And so we have the testimony of the Johannine community. This is the testimony of him who wrote these things down, and we know his testimony is true. We're not claiming to be him. We know his testimony is true. Well, that makes better sense of everything that goes on in those last 11 chapters of the Gospel of John, including the bit that the beloved disciple goes right into Caiaphas' house after Jesus has been taken there, and Peter's outside warming his hands. Well, why did they let the beloved disciple in? They knew him. In fact, some of them had been at his funeral recently, right? Now, I'm not an archaeologist or a son of an archaeologist. I love archaeology, but you know what they say about archaeologists, their life is constantly in ruins. And so I just analyze archaeological data. But if I was an archaeologist, the one thing I would love to find is the tombstone of Lazarus. it would say, died 29 AD. And then below that it would say, died 74 AD. Now this would confuse some people. This would confuse some people. 2 death dates. Because Lazarus did have 2 death dates, for sure. Yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry, this might be a silly question. The way I heard you was that you're not necessarily convinced that 1 John was written by the elder or by Lazarus, or you can.
Oh, I think it's the personal sermon. I don't think it's a letter.
Yes.
It's a sermon, and I think it comes from the beloved disciple, because the themes in John 14, 15, 16, and 17 are repeated and amplified in 1 John. So I would say the beloved disciple is the source of the material in the Gospel of John, and definitely the source of 1 John. John, the elder, simply collected this sermon and promulgated it, and there's no attribution in that document of who wrote it.
Yes.
None whatsoever. But it's a sermon. This is another thing. We have some sermons in the New Testament. Stop calling them letters.
Yes.
They're not letters. Hebrews is not a letter. It's a very long sermon. Don't try preaching it all at once, okay? So, other thoughts, other questions? Yes, Dana.
I just wanted to hear your thoughts about the importance of an apostolic connection for each of the Gospels.
I think it's extremely important. Conservative Christians don't tend to think past the canon. You know, it's okay, it was all written in the 1st century, we're done now. Well, no, because there was the church who lovingly collected these sources and put them together. Probably, as Graham Stanton once said, the earliest collection was the letters of Paul and the 4 Gospels. And here's the interesting thing about that. You know the headings of the Gospels, kata Ioannes or kata Markon, or etc. Well, you don't need those headings if there's only one Gospel. So those headings seem to have been added when there was a collection of the several Gospels together. That's why you need according to John as opposed to according to Mark, as opposed to according to Matthew, as opposed to according to Luke. So I do think that it's right to say that in the 2nd century we had a collection of the 4 canonical Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Stick with those and you can't go wrong. Okay? Ignore the Gnostic documents, ignore the Gospel of Thomas, etc., etc. Although I do have to say the Gospel of Peter is hilarious. The end of the Gospel of Peter is especially hilarious because you may have noticed that there is no description of the moment of Jesus' resurrection in any of the canonical Gospels. But in the Gospel of Peter, we get it in Hollywood edition. I always envisioned, the crocodile man being there as the eyewitness of all this. Crikey, it's dark, and then the lights, they're bright. Oh, it's also bright. And there's this hairy angel rolling back the stone. And out of the two, here comes a really bright Jesus. I need my sunglasses. Oh, he's coming out, and behind him, across the size of Walmart, walks out of the tomb. Now that's what I call a Hollywood version of the resurrection of Jesus. That's the Gospel of Peter, which was not written by Peter, from the end of the 2nd century AD. What happened is, of course, that there were lots of attempts to fill in the gaps in Paul's letters by having a letter to the Laodiceans, or the Gospels with the Gospel of Peter and other Gospels as well. But frankly, we don't need them. What we need is Gospels in touch with the original eyewitnesses and apostles, and that's what we have in the canon. Yes, ma'am.
I just had a question about the Last Supper in John 13:23, where it says there was one leaning on Jesus' bosom, one of the disciples whom Jesus loved.
Yes, that's Lazarus. It's in his house, and this is the usual practice. The host reclines on the couch with his chief guest. And by the way, there's no account of the Last Supper in John 13. There's only a foot washing. There's no, this is my body broken for you. There's no, this is my blood poured out for you. And if you look at the chronological preface in John 13, it's earlier in the week. So that meal was one of several meals that Jesus had with disciples. That one was earlier in the week, and that's when Judas began the process of betraying Jesus. It didn't all wait till the last minute of the Last Supper. That's later in the week.
You
would put that on Wednesday?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Maybe even Tuesday, but certainly earlier in the week. It doesn't really matter which one it was. But the foot washing was not anywhere in the account of the Last Supper, and certainly wasn't a Jewish ritual for the Passover at all. It was something different that Jesus did. I once preached in a Brethren church, Church of the Brethren church, and their practice is to always have foot washing with the Lord's Supper. I did not know this, but that's okay. I'm just a Methodist. So I preached upstairs in the sanctuary, and then we retired to have a meal, because not only did they practice foot washing with the Lord's Supper, but they had it in the context of a meal, a full meal. So we're in the fellowship hall downstairs, and I'm sitting next to this really ancient saint. And all of a sudden, the next thing I know, he's taking my shoes off and my socks off, and he is going to wash my feet. And you know what? My instinctive reaction to that was the same as Peter's. I am not worthy for a saint of this church to do that. Stop right now. But I'll let him do it, because it's the only time I ever had my feet washed. So, you know, it was for me, it was a spiritual moment, because I appreciated that they were trying to put together the whole story in one package. Yes, sir.
Sorry, this is just a clarification. Did you say...
Where in Australia are you from?
Yeah, I'm from South Africa, sorry.
Okay, I apologize.
Yeah, so a bit better. I'm kidding. But are you saying that most of the early church fathers had sort of a post-millennial view?
No, I'm saying the earliest church fathers had a premillennial view.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying you have to wait until you get past Constantine, where you have cranky people like Eusebius and Augustus who say, well, no, Jesus put Satan in a holding pattern all throughout church history. You know, that really doesn't work with the New Testament. When we hear other texts in the New Testament say that Satan's running around like a devouring lion and, you know, is constantly bothering Christians, and we have a promise that one day Christ is going to stomp out the devil, but meantime he's given us a hard time. So I don't think that theology works with Revelation 21 through 3.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification.
Sure. All right, I think y'all need to go to bed. I know I do, because I'm leaving tomorrow. So God bless you, everyone.